Greetings, this is dslyecxi, and today we're going to take a look at the Arma 3 Dev Branch, Work in Progress, Advanced Flight Model from Take On Helicopters. In the interest of fairness, please remember that this is still in development software, and anything I talk about here could potentially change. If it does, I'll do an updated video at the release of the Hilo expansion that clarifies what's different between what I say here and how the product ships. When that video is live, this little blurb right here is where I'll put the link, as well as in the video description, Twitter, so on and so forth. If you're viewing this after the Hilo expansion is shipped and you saw a link there just now, right back there, please view it. Now, to get started, there will be several products shown here. At a minimum, you're going to see Arma 3, Take On Helicopters, and DCS Huey. Maybe a clip from DCS Black Shark and DCS MI8, I'm not sure. If you'd like a full talkthrough of what sim-level helicopter dynamics are like, please feel free to check out this video here, where I cover how to fly a DCS Huey. This is the gold standard of simulation right now, as is the DCS Black Shark for coaxial rotor helicopters. So what exactly is the Advanced Flight Model? It's from Take On Helicopters. That was a product that Bohemia released that was aimed at giving a helicopter-oriented experience. From a marketing standpoint, Take On is a Hilo enthusiast game with trimmings of simulation. Though they sidestep around that word a little bit. That's okay. I'm not criticizing Take On for what it is. SimHQ reviewed Take On in 2012, and their most notable complaint was that the helicopter dynamics were subpar for an authentic simulation. They also used the words, quote, a whole heap of fun to describe it, so clearly there's something good there despite some of the issues with the simulation. If you'd like to read the whole review, again, reference the video description. Check out page 4 for a breakdown of the different aspects of simulation that were encountered in it. Since we're talking about the flight model specifically here, I just want to make sure that I was clear in stating that it's what's up for discussion, not Take On the game, just the flight model and related features as they pertain to Arma 3. Arma 3's helicopter DLC, which, by the way, will introduce firing from vehicles, aka one of the most desired features of all time in the series. The Hilo DLC aims to take aspects of the Take On flight model and put them into the Arma 3 helicopters. Anyhow, enough setup. Let's look at some situations in Arma 3, Take On, and DCS, and compare the experiences. Now, for reference, I have the following flight gear, which I'll be using for each of these products. I use a Microsoft Sidewinder 2 force feedback stick, MFG crosswind pedals, a Warthog throttle, and a Track IR5. I found this combination to be the closest representation of helicopter controls that are available for the desktop. We're going to start with Take On using the medium helicopter, which is essentially a Huey. This allows an easy comparison to the DCS Huey, which we'll alternate between as this goes on. Now pay no mind to the graphics, like I said, this is Take On, this is the flight model, we're doing this because we want a one-to-one comparison. After having said that, first, take a look at the interior. This is about on par for an Arma 2 model, which is roughly what it is, and the gauges and general level of artwork are serviceable, but by no means pretty. Arma 3 looks significantly nicer. You can see that the controls all respond correctly to your input, which allows you to visually see what any given real-world physical input is doing within the game. Now, we're going to take off and come to a hover, and then we'll turn and taxi to the runway, turn onto it, and do a takeoff utilizing translational lift. You'll notice that I'm flying at a pretty high speed here, but I'm not taking off with translational lift. It doesn't seem as pronounced as in DCS. I actually have to pull up manually to get into it, but it is there. I've tested it more extensively and it does exist. Okay, so that's what it looks like in Take On. Let's see the same in DCS. The DCS cockpit, as expected, is incredibly detailed and very clearly legible. It's a full fidelity simulator, so this is to be expected. I'm not docking anything from Take On or Arma 3 for having lower fidelity in this respect, as that wasn't the goal of either project. I'm just simply showing some nice Hilo modeling. You can appreciate that. It looks good. As you can see here, the cyclic, pedals, and collective are all animated, and each instrument is perfectly readable and behaves as you'd expect it to. Once again, we're going to come up into a hover and ground effect, taxi forward, turn onto the runway, and accelerate. Note how the Hilo's kind of bobbing and swaying as it moves. It feels real. and once we hit effective translational lift, we're pulled up into the air without any additional input. So between the two, you'll notice a few differences. In DCS, we see the shuttering of transverse flow shortly before we gain effective translational lift. You'll also notice that the DCS helo behaves in a much more convincing fashion. You have a real sense of inertia and weight to the aircraft. I find the take-on version to feel very bland by comparison. There's little simulated head movement from aircraft forces. The camera shake seems exaggerated and happens at seemingly random times. The helo doesn't have that same kind of hanging from the rotor disc behavior that you see in DCS. And just generally speaking, it's not as dynamic as you'd expect a helicopter to behave, considering how it actually works. But let's move on to forward flight and some other behaviors. It's worth noting that the force feedback implementation of take-on is rather lacking, and that's carried over into Arma 3 as well. There is no force trim behavior. Trimming the helo it's nonsensical with a force stick. I don't even understand what's going on there. It doesn't behave how it should, and I don't really want to think too much more about it. But in DCS, force trim works as expected, and the resistance on the stick gives a great tactile indication of how far you've moved the cyclic out of trim. Setting a new trim position works the way it should, and releasing trim is the same. In short, it behaves how a helicopter's force trim system really works, whereas take-on simply does not. One of the biggest complaints I have is that in take-on, and now Arma 3's advanced flight model, control inputs in general feel very sensitive and exaggerated. We'll touch on that more later, but for now, here's a fun comparison. I suspect this next one is the root of a lot of issues with take-on and Arma 3. Let's get into it here. This is flying straight and level in take-on at about 80 knots, and then applying full left pedal. Now, that's a bit peculiar, as you'd expect the tail rotor to have substantially reduced effectiveness with 80 knots of airflow over the aircraft, and by association the tail rotor. Now, let's look at the same situation in DCS. This is exactly the same. In this, it's 80 knots indicated airspeed. We're flying down the runway and bam, full left pedal. Aha, there you go. Now, which one do you believe? So that wild and crazy roll we had happening in take-on, that spinning around, flipping over, recovering, and then everything's happy fun times, let's try to get that happening in the Huey in DCS. Now, this is going to be a little difficult to do because the controls just don't respond the same way as in take-on. And that's a good thing if I wasn't already clear about that. This is me trying to use the cyclic and rudders to try to approximate the take-on behavior. You can see I'm having to work a lot, rolling, pedals, everything, and finally, we get to the point that the rotor's like, fuck this, I'm out, and he just goes flying off the aircraft. So if you can get into that kind of sharp maneuver, that can actually cause the rotor system, the blades, to disengage from the aircraft. You can get a tail boom strike, horrible things can happen. It's just bad news. And a helicopter without a rotor, it's a very expensive coffin. So take-on's flight model leads to some outrageous behaviors at times. This rudder behavior is blatantly incorrect. It's wacky, and it factors into everything. Rudder's used constantly in a helo. Now, personally, I'm looking for a simulation-grade flight model here. I'm either going to have an Arma 2 or Arma 3 one, which I like, which simplifies things and works fine with a mouse and keyboard, or I'm going to go all the way to something like DCS, where what I'm learning is applicable and accurate. When I see something like that happen in take-on, I don't have confidence at that point. I see that and I think, wow, that is wrong. That is way wrong. And if that's wrong, what else is wrong? Well, let's find out. What's next on the list? We have translational lift, which we've seen when I was doing the takeoff. It's there. It's not as obvious as in DCS, but it is there. Obviously, there's collective induced torque, where you pull on the collective, increase the pitch of the blades, and have to offset the additional torque with pedal input, which is how helicopters work, and that shows up, and it's nice. Here we have ground effect. It shows itself fairly well, though it feels a bit weak at times. You can see that increasing collective slightly will put you into a higher level of ground effect, and this is consistent with how it works in reality, and it's nice to see that. As a minor aside, take-on and Arma 3 kind of abstract a lot of stuff that's not simulated into the category of, quote, stress damage. So you'll get damage and it'll be indicated by the aircraft shaking, and after a while, in theory, this will ground the helo in some way. We already have the control issues where it just doesn't feel correct, feels exaggerated and just overly sensitive. And, I literally have a gold standard program, DCS Huey, which I can compare it to. I've used full-scale helo simulators in the past with actual proper controls, an SH-60 and an Apache, and the controls in Take-On and Arma 3. There's something off about them, and I don't know what it is. The primitive joystick binding of Take-On and Arma 3 certainly doesn't help any, as you just don't know if there's something in there that's fudging things up. For all I know, it could very well be a well-configured flight model, but there could be something in the interface between RotorLib and Take-On or Arma 3 that's messing things up. That's possible. I hope so. I hope it's something that can be fixed, but I haven't really figured out how to describe it yet. The most significant difference between the two models can be seen in how the Vortex ring state is simulated. Vortex ring state, or VRS, is one of the most dangerous traps in a helicopter, and in my simulation experience, it's the leading cause of simulated pilot deaths. Probably a pretty big cause of real pilot deaths as well, but I'm going to stay in my lane here, talk about simulations. If you're ever at a trade show like ITSIC and you watch people get on the helo simulators, like the flight safety one, which I fucking love, and you watch them fly around, if they're not actual pilots, you'll see them die to VRS all the time. It's amazing. It's predictable. It's like clockwork. When you're playing DCS Huey or similar, VRS is how people tend to die. VRS is a major factor in differentiating between a helicopter game and a helicopter simulation. Now, here I'll demonstrate the procedure for setting up VRS in Take-On. I'll climb, go to auto hover to ensure ideal conditions for VRS, and then I'll drop collective fully. Just watch and listen. Now I'm going to apply collective, and you'll note the descent stops. Now, is that how it's supposed to work? Let's find out. Let's look at the same thing in DCS. I know how to recover from VRS. I won't attempt a proper VRS recovery. I'll simply do what you saw work successfully in Take-On. And you'll notice several things. One, as I drop collective, my descent rate plummets. I'm controlling my rotor RPM to prevent an overspeed, but my descent is out of control. Next, as I apply collective, nothing changes. I keep falling very fast. I keep falling, and the helo explodes, and everybody's dead. This is what VRS is. This is how it works. And this is what DCS does that Take-On does not. This is such a fundamental aspect of helicopter flight that the absence of it in Take-On and Arma 3 is frankly rather shocking. I didn't realize this until today. Literally today. I assumed it was there, and I never really played Take-On, so I never learned otherwise. But nope, it's not there. If you look at the actual Take-On site, linked in the description, the Take-On feature list shows Vortex Ring as a feature planned in patch, with the release date of the game being October 27th of 2011. This feature was not patched in and does not exist in the current dev branch of Arma 3, and it's not in Take-On helicopters. Personally, I think it should be a top priority for this DLC. Without it, the label of this as an advanced flight model is questionable. So we've established the basics between Take-On helicopters and DCS using the same aircraft. Let's move on to Arma 3 and DCS to show what's different. Arma 3's advanced flight model is a Take-On model stripped of some things that aren't important for Arma's purposes. So without VRS, what is it that helps to keep the Arma 3 helos from being completely absurd in their behavior? Well, it's two things. The stress damage I mentioned earlier, which by the way can be disabled with the difficulty option, so don't rely on that. And simulation of rotor RPM. While the absence of VRS means you can come in as steeply as you want so long as you remember to slow down before landing, the presence of rotor RPM means that you can't pull absurd maneuvers without bleeding off that RPM and potentially stalling out your blades and dying in a horrible fireball. This is welcome. Not the death, I mean the rotor RPM feature. The RPM is something that should be there, and it helps to add some depth to the experience, which is particularly necessary considering the absence of VRS. But to tangent for a second, you'll see that I have the Helo 2D instruments enabled here. This feature exists in Take-On as well, I wasn't using it earlier. It can be particularly helpful in Arma 3 in aircraft that don't have proper instruments modeled in the cockpit. They're also generally much clearer to read, and this is a nice thing considering monitor resolutions, field of view, and blah blah blah. Let's not get into that. So yeah, getting back to that rotor RPM thing. Rotor RPM is an important aspect of helicopter flight. It's something you want to keep an eye on. If the RPM gets too low, you fall out of the sky. If it's so important, there should be a rotor RPM gauge in this gauge list, but there's not. The indication of low RPM is an audible change in the sound of the rotors, as well as a yellow caution light or a red you stepped in it light. It would be fantastic if an actual gauge was placed in the cockpit, and this seems like a reasonable thing to request. Next up, we have a major pet peeve of mine from Arma's damage model. In short, Arma does not handle aircraft collisions with objects or terrain very well at all. The easiest way to show this is to demonstrate a skid landing in DCS and then in Arma 3. This is just me blitzing in at a high forward airspeed but a low descent rate. In reality, this might be a bit sparky on touchdown, but these sorts of run-on landings are a thing in reality and can be used when something like the tail rotor decides that, it's done working for the day and you're still in the air. So there we go. In DCS, touchdown, reduced collective, put more weight on the skids, more friction, and you grind to a noisy halt. And then there's Arma 3. Kaboom. Now, to be fair, they did introduce proper helicopter wheels for wheeled aircraft, which allows you to taxi on the ground, as well as land at higher speeds with your wheels. That's cool. But skids are still a total fucking death trap because, I don't know. It's always been that way. It needs fixing. Now, the DCS damage model is not without flaws, but it is a very convincing representation of all sorts of damage. Specifically here, I'd like to just look at the collision aspect of things. Here, I'm going to take my rotors off on this conveniently placed and possibly occupied rotor detacher. That's pretty cool. That's how you end up with a neat situation on the ground. That's what combat search and rescue is there for, or tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel. You don't get this in Arma 3. If you hit your rotors like that, ka-fucking-boom. If you roll like that, ka-fucking-boom. If you touch down a little too hard, blammo. Hit a bush, explode. Hit a rock, explode. Clip a branch with your rotor, explode. Track your skids through a treetop, explode. You explode. You just explode at the drop of a hat anytime anything ever gets anywhere near your aircraft, and it's really frustrating. The skids do not absorb shock, and the damage in general for collisions is atrocious. I would love to see this fixed in the Healy expansion. That seems like a perfect time for it. Pretty please. It would be so nice. Now, as the DCS. DCS does this fairly well, with the glaring omission of colliding with trees, which we'll conveniently sidestep here because that doesn't really help my argument much, now does it? In all seriousness, DCS has some sexy damage models. You can crumple the skids, smash up the rotors and the tail rotor, tear off the tail boom, break instruments and bash up the hull, catch on fire, which is always exciting, bounce from hard landings, and just generally have a really interesting crash dynamic. Of course, if you come in too hard, you'll explode at some point, but it's far more believable than the Arma 3 helicopter construction method where the aircraft is apparently built from solidified nitroglycerin. One final little quibble about Arma 3. The helos don't have animated controls for the most part. Usually it's just a cyclic, which is sometimes reversed like in the Ghost Hawk currently, which is, obviously like a minor bug. No big deal. But the collective and the pedals don't currently move. This would be another nice improvement, and it's something that Take On already did. So let's wrap this up. The advanced flight model of Arma 3 is currently in development. There's time to make changes, that's why it's on the dev branch. Some of this stuff could happen, I hope it does. I would like to look at Arma 3 as having a mostly correct flight model, so those who think that they're getting a really realistic representation of helo flight are actually correct. To quickly rehash the main improvements I'd like to see Vortex ring state. I'd consider this to be essential to be taken seriously as a flight model. A review of the flight dynamics and the tail rotor influence in particular, which ties into the above, about the controls seeming odd, like there could be something wrong with the flight modeling there. A rotor RPM gauge as part of the gauge panel. Improved collision handling with everything. And more immersive camera effects, indication of ground effect and other turbulence, and better 6 degrees of freedom cockpit handling. I feel far more immersed in a DCS helo, and it's in part because of these aspects. So that's a basic list of things I'd like to see. I think the advanced flight model right now is not up to par for people expecting a comprehensive model of helicopter flight dynamics. And it's to a dangerous degree thanks to the lack of Vortex ring state. I think the aspects that bother me are the ones that can be addressed, and I hope they can be looked into. Now, to put it in perspective, when all's said and done, the Halo DLC is going to have fire from vehicles. That alone has me about 100 billion times more excited for the future of Arma 3 than anything else that expansion will be bringing. If the flight model gets fixed in the ways I've described, hey, that's gravy. But if nothing else, fired from vehicles. I'm so hyped for that. So, this is dslyecxi. I hope you've enjoyed my helicopter ramblings, and I encourage you to check this stuff out for yourself and draw your own conclusions about it. It's not 100% of the way to what I wish it would be, but that's not a total condemnation of it. DCS isn't 100% of the way of what I want it to be either. Having high standards and vast expectations when you're dealing with reasonably niche products created by small teams can be an interesting experience. To Bohemia specifically, I hope you take this on board in the manner in which it was intended. I appreciate your work. I hope that this and any other feedback from the community can help to make Kilo DLC and anything else a better product. Thank you for being you, and to everyone, until next time, take care. I'll see you in the skies.